1 month ago, Jeremy Lin was a bench warmer for the New York Knicks and was on the brink of being cut by his third NBA team in 2 seasons. But on March 4th, he got significant playing time against the New Jersey Nets. Came up big with 25 points and 7 assists in a win. Less than a week later, in his third start, he scored 38 points in a nationally televised game against Kobe Bryant and the Lakers. As Lin kept putting up big numbers, making clutch shots, and leading the Knicks to win after win, the media and fan frenzy became a phenomenon unlike any that we've ever seen. So Lin, an undrafted player who graduated from Harvard, is the first NBA player of Chinese or Taiwanese American descent and fourth Asian American player overall. His rise, which has had elements of surprise, suspense, excitement, and controversy, has become a story that has transcended sports and dominated pop culture and even general news coverage over the past month. So Bob, some of the things that Jeff mentioned there, so Asian American, Harvard, undrafted, playing in New York City. Of those factors, how would you rank those factors as far as what made Linsanity Linsanity?
That's a good question. I think, again, not being 100% sure I'm right, but I would think that the number one factor, I'm going to say playing in New York City. He's playing in the media capital on a team where he had the opportunity to surprise with the success and the exposure. And also I think there was, to a large degree, and the others I'm sure have feelings about this, the timing was really right. His insertion into the lineup against the Nets, the Giants had just won the Super Bowl. There was a very good New York City sports vibe going on. He wanted to keep the party going. He comes in, he does well. Underdog story, so I say that the Harvard element is an aspect of that. For a long time, I felt that in most of what started as the city, then became the country and the world, the Asian piece was not the dominant piece, unless you were Asian American. In which case, it was number one with a bullet and remains the top story. But I think by and large, that was not the compelling aspect. And I just remember that week, I mean, you know, we talk about this like it's ingrained in deep history. We're talking about a month's worth of activity. In the first couple of days, you know, I was at the gym and I heard people talking, not Asian American, and they were just really psyched that the Knicks had a point guard. I mean, that was basically the beginning and ending of it. And the way he played, obviously, was exciting to them. But, you know, never, and I was listening, you know, never once did they, you know, anyone say, and, you know, and he's an Asian American guy or anything like that. It wasn't part of the story. But I think we've got two stories going on, and I think that's maintained itself. We've got what Jeremy Lin is to Asian Americans and what he is to everyone else. And those stories are starting to merge a little.
Well, you know, what's interesting, and I come to this as being the only person who's not a sports writer on this panel, you know, and I have the, I think, good fortune here to be talking about culture, to write about culture, because that's where I think the lasting impact of Jeremy Lin's going to be, regardless of where his ultimate career is. You know, there are arguments on my Facebook page right now about whether he's an elite player. I think that's a crazy argument, right? But I'll get into it because it's fun. But in a larger sense, I mean, I think that what Jeremy Lin represents is, at the very least, a watershed in A, how Asian Americans think about themselves, B, to a certain extent, how the world and the nation think about Asian Americans, and C, I actually think that there's an impact within the NBA itself on how it looks at its assessment of players, period. I mean, setting aside the race thing alone or even the Harvard thing alone, I think there's a very strong sense that, especially, you know, in a year in which, you know, the movie Moneyball was actually nominated for a Best Picture. It's never going to win, but, you know, and it didn't. So, but this notion of this reflection on how we think about sports, you know, what works, what doesn't, you know, whether or not it's just about having a good body or you know, hitting certain metrics, you know, that makes a player. You know, we talk about intangibles, right? There was actually a really great piece in the Times talking about, you know, his work ethic and, you know, I mean, just the way that he actually went back and addressed a lot of his deficits. There are things that don't show up on a stat sheet in a lot of cases that I think really are causing people to think about the game in a different way.
I kind of feel you. I mean, you know, as African American, and a couple of disclaimers. I mean, I see many things in American history through a Afro-American prism, and as an American story. All these things are American stories. So we've been here before. 1910, we were here with Jack Johnson. You know, blacks couldn't box, they say. You know, this whole ethnic thing, we're always told, what's your ethnicity? This kind of Wizard of Oz tells every ethnicity what you cannot do. All right? So African American, can't box. So Jack Johnson was a big deal. 1910, you've heard the expression, the Great White Hope. Well, Jack Johnson won the heavyweight championship of the world. First one. Big deal. People, black folks, dancing in the street. And after he won, there were riots in the street. A lot of black folks got killed because they had kind of stepped out of their place. There were these riots where a lot of white people were killing black people for celebrating. Said, no, that's not your place. Fast forward, Joe Louis, you know, first black American hero. You know, we were fighting the Nazis, and this guy wanted to prove that the myth of, you know, and then Jackie Robinson. You know, Jackie Robinson integrates. So and Arthur Ashe wins, you know, Althea Gibbs. So I get it. You know, we get that piece of it. You know, this was a great story at so many different levels, because and just as a disclaimer, my daughter's boyfriend played with Jeremy at Harvard his first grade. So I kind of knew that this guy was coming. You know, and he was a good guy, great guy. And that kind of stuff. But I think we're all kind of, and me, I guess when I look at this stuff, you know, I've been at the Times for 30 years this last month, and I've been doing this for pay since 1974. So I'm not necessarily a Pharisee when it comes to this. So I'm like going through my Rolex and damn, now wait, this is really off the chart. I mean, even for me, this is way, way off the chart. So let me go back and find out what's the precedent. I mean, what is at the root of this stuff? And my thing is that racism is down there somewhere, you know, just what's the story? And I think we've all hit it. A was the fact that this is New York, and everything here is trouble. Whatever you do, if you do it well, it's 5 times as much. If you do it terrible, it's, so that was one thing. And I think you bring up a great point. The first thing was not necessarily that he was Asian American. Because remember, and I'll kind of, remember, he's and Taiwanese. Remember, and I remember a time when the Taiwanese Little League baseball team was winning all the World Series. There wasn't a whole lot of love letters sent to the Taiwanese baseball team, if you remember. Yes. And in fact, good old American racism was rearing its head. Well, they must be too old. Mm-hmm. That's all they do is play baseball. I mean, it was not parades for the Taiwanese baseball team. So, you know, when people are saying how great this is, I'm like, okay, you know, it's always great when it's just one. It's always great when it's just one. Now it starts to be 5, 10. They don't necessarily come from Harvard. You know, now it's not. So,
so like a few years from now, it's going to be 75. The NBA, 75% Asian Americans.
Hey, you know what? And then let's come back here. Then, so anyway, so I just think there was a lot of figure, and I'll have more to say later. But I just think that. There's just a lot of factors, but the worst factor is that it saved Tony's job.
So Pablo, you did a story for SI on Lynn in 2010, and even in that, it seemed like there were things were simmering. There was he had a following. He was even quoted as being kind of like taken aback by how crazy things were getting. I mean, literally know what would happen 2 years later. But so what are you? I know you're surprised by what happened, but did you kind of like see it coming a little bit?
Right. So I remember pitching this story to Sports Illustrated in like 2009. I mean, I graduated from Harvard. The only expertise that was unique that I brought to the table was my knowledge of Harvard sports. That is not a very useful chip. Then Jeremy Lin happened. But in 2009, I was pitching this story saying, look, there's this Taiwanese American guard at Harvard who's an NBA prospect. He could be drafted into the NBA. Would have been one of the first, I think the first maybe full-blooded Asian American, however you want to define the terms, this parsing there. There's some other figures historically. Wat Misaka with the Knicks was a Japanese American from Utah. But anyway, so I pitched this story, didn't get much traction on its face. You know, the other component to that story, if you look back and read it, was that the Harvard basketball team was suddenly good. Tommy Amaker was hired, and this is also true. They're now in contention for their first NCAA tournament berth since 1946. Okay, so you have those two factors finally, and so the story gets approved in I think winter winter of 2009, and I go out there to visit Jeremy. And again, the only chip I have is I went to Harvard. Jeremy and I hit it off. You know, it was as surreal a reporting trip even back then for me, just because I was thinking, oh my God, I'm actually writing a story for Sports Illustrated about a Harvard athlete. Like, this is nuts. The fact that it was 4 pages in the magazine was itself, you know, so much further beyond what I ever expected. And so we hit it off. And even then, I mean, I asked him, you know, he was, I think one of the things that maybe some of the folks in this room know is that Jeremy was followed when he was at Harvard. I mean, he sold out Harvard versus Santa Clara at Santa Clara, which, even if you don't know about basketball, you can probably imagine that game has never been sold out before. I mean, why would you ever go to see Harvard Santa Clara? But Jeremy did that. He's from the Bay Area, had a strong following among Asian Americans specifically. That was his niche. You know, he hadn't gone much further beyond that, but in the Bay Area and certainly across the country, you saw Asian American fans coming into Harvard's 2,100-seat arena, Levites Pavilion, which, you know, I remember going to see Harvard Dartmouth for this story, and next to me, ironically, was Sean Gregory from Time, was doing his own story. So there was a media attention there. You know, there was something there. And I remember asking Jeremy in his dorm room. You know, we were sitting around. We had just tried to play Xbox, wanted to play Halo, but his Xbox was broken. So times have changed for him financially also since then. And I asked him, you know, what's the most surprising thing about where you are in the Ivy League, you know, as a basketball player at any level? And he said, well, it's pretty much everything. I mean, it was the fact that he had fans at all, the fact that he was a star at Harvard in the Ivy League. He would talk about at Harvard, you know, being an Asian American athlete at Harvard was something of an outlier. You know, you didn't walk around and suddenly the football team and the baseball team and the basketball team certainly were just Asian Americans who were smart and good at sports. That's not how it works in the Ivy League. Asians in the Ivy League are still a minority, athletically. And so it was very surprising for him. And when I left that trip and I wrote the story and I said he might be an NBA prospect, my personal expectation level for him was to be a backup point guard. You know, and that was roundly criticized by a lot of my friends and other people in the business as pretty naive. You know, he wasn't drafted ultimately, and that wasn't terribly surprising to me. But Jeremy was, I thought, he had the ability and the talent and all the basketball intangibles. I mean, we all sort of familiar with his basketball IQ, which is his own loaded term. But he had a feel for the game as a point guard and as a scorer that I thought certainly belonged in an NBA roster. Now, whether I thought that this would happen, I think it's pretty safe to say that I didn't ever think that I would be at a panel about him or that I would have written 2 cover stories for SI. All of that is so far beyond my purview and certainly his. And he's told me that, you know, in the recent time since he became a Knick. And so, yeah, it was the thing that I think about when I think about Jeremy is what it's like to be basically world famous overnight. I mean, that's not something that he could deal with. You know, he was okay with dealing with really at Harvard when he had fans in this very niche community. And now, I mean, that's the thing that's most surreal about all of this to me. Mm-hmm. And that speaks to the relative history athletically, not just in a sport particularly.
I think why we're here on the panel, why we're having a panel, though, is really about sort of what Jeff was getting at, which is that, and this is where his ethnicity, I think, is a factor. It is the drawing in of people who are not identifying themselves as sports fans. Mm-hmm. It is the sudden, you know, putting him on the front page, having the cottage industry of following this guy, which is really not about sports. I mean, I think that is the phenomenon that, you know, you really need to look at and say, and even on the negative side, I think some of the headlines where people have taken offense to. It's funny, you know, over the span of only a few short weeks, you see a new headline, you're like, and as an Asian American, you're like, okay, let me think about this. Right. How do I feel about this?
Right, exactly.
It feels kind of maybe not good, but
like all of a sudden we're having that conversation though, which in the past probably would never have happened, right?
No, so I think that's really, that's what the Linsanity, there's the first pun, is about. That's why it's a huge story. It's that everyone else is interested. I think the sports are just sort of, that's an aspect of the story that could make or break the rest of it.